Sure.
All right. Pleased to be joined with Monte Hilleman, a familiar name and face to people in the Twin Cities development community. Spent 2 decades or nearly 2 decades with the St. Paul Port Authority and is currently the leader of Climate Investment Solutions Department at the Sustainable Investment Group, where he oversees market-based strategies to finance decarbonization efforts. So Monty, thanks for joining me. How you doing today?
Good, good, good. Thanks for the opportunity to chat with you, Brian.
Absolutely. Well, I just gave a very brief introduction there to what you're doing with the Sustainable Investment Group. Wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the Sustainable Investment Group, its mission, and kind of what your role is within that organization.
Sure thing. Uh, Sustainable Investment Group, SIG, I was a client of theirs actually, and historically knew them as a lead consultant, a green building consultant that specialized in getting buildings certified. Um, I was on the board of the U.S. Green Building Council with Asa Posner from SIG for a number of years. Got to know him well and brought him on to be our lead consultant to certify the Port Authority's new headquarters space. I was responsible for the design and build out of that space in Treasure Island Center. Um, we believe LEED Platinum certification is forthcoming. And they also helped us get pre-certified LEED Platinum, LEED for Communities, Platinum for the entire Hillcrest site, now the Heights. So I knew these folks as a sustainability consultant, a lead consultant, and started talking to Asa several months ago. And he said, our ESG and our decarbonization team could probably use some help. And I was like, what do you mean? ESG team, decarbonization team? How did I not know these things existed? And so we do have a fairly large ESG team. We serve as the back office ESG staff or department for some of the largest portfolios in the country. Hines, Rockefeller Group, SL Green, the largest landlord in New York City. Bunch of folks. We do all the reporting to the international ESG frameworks, the GRESBs, the CDPs, et cetera. We do data acquisition, all the local law ordinance. Local law 97 in New York is starting to come through with some heavy fines. We're hearing some fines out in Denver that are starting to look pretty aggressive for those that aren't leaning into decarbonization. So we have an engineering team that does modeling, energy audits, commissioning, retro commissioning, all the sort of green engineering stuff. And what we realized when we started talking was SIG's team is very adept, about 50 people around the country, at telling you what you could do to make a building green, how you would do it, how much it would cost you, and what you might save. But that was about as far as they could go. And I was at a point in my career where I was seeing the writing on the wall related to my past job, as you mentioned, at the St. Paul Port Authority. There are some very high sustainability goals for the Heights, and including all buildings being decarbonized, all electric, net zero buildings. And we were transacting land this spring. I was getting a little nervous that as those first transactions started happening and people started getting cost estimates, they ultimately were going to come back to me and say, what are you talking about? How are we ever going to pay for this? And I have been getting pretty smart about the Inflation Reduction Act over the last couple of years now, and really realized what we needed, what was missing in the marketplace were some pretty conventional financing tools, 10-year cash flows, pro formas, et cetera, and some associated financial metrics that show people how to use the Inflation Reduction Act. It's not enough anymore to talk about what it is. We've been talking about that for 18 months, and it's a little frustrating. It's like, what does it look like in a pro forma? How do you finance it? What's the bank think? What does the appraiser think? Really getting into the developer's role of implementing and monetizing. So we talk about stack, model, and monetize. And it was clear to me that buyers at the Heights were going to need this information. And because I had just spent the previous decade redeveloping the old 3M World Headquarters site on the east side of St. Paul, I kind of knew what the next 10, 12 years of my career was going to look like, frankly. And I was going to be somewhat limited by really only touching that next 15 or maybe 20 buildings that got built at that site. And the more I learned about the scale and the scope of what SIG does for these large portfolios nationally, internationally now, we just picked up a 76-story tower in Busan, South Korea, that we're doing LEED certification on. So ability to impact far more buildings, far much more square footage with this kind of knowledge. I had started building these tools while I was at the port, knowing that buyers were going to need these tools, and ultimately, had to get infrastructure built, had to argue over sidewalk widths and turn lanes, and 60 hours a week of doing that doesn't leave a lot of time for building advanced financial models. So I spent my first 3 or 4 months at SIG with my head down building, and now have a net zero pro forma that we share and use with our clients. Have what we call an after-tax discounted cash flow valuation model, which is like a DCF an appraiser would use, but on an after-tax basis. And that allows us to show the Inflation Reduction Act tax benefits above the line, if you will, in key financial ratios, internal rate of return, yield on cost, cash on cash, et cetera. The kinds of things that players in the marketplace need to see in order to believe in the impact of these tools. And the impact is staggering. Once you add up 4, 5, 6 of these green financing techniques, the impact is really going to revolutionize how we build buildings and finance buildings.
Okay. So how long have you been with SIG now?
I've been there 5 months.
Okay.
A lot of client visits, a lot of travel the first 2, 3 months, just getting to meet some of our more established clients, and a lot of presentations on what these tools are. I think maybe 5 panels in the last 2 weeks here. Twice at the AIA Minnesota conference last week. That was a blast. Yeah, so it was head down for a few months building this stuff, and now trying to let the world know about it.
And you're based right here in the Twin Cities, but have clients all over the world, right?
Yeah. I'm in the Twin Cities. Some of my colleagues are here. Asa, I mentioned, he's our national VP of sales. Jen Mahone leads our sustainability department. A few others here in town. A big presence in Atlanta, where we were founded, and then big presence on the West Coast and East Coast.
Okay. So who are your primary clients here? Are you primarily working with developers, or can you give me a sense of who's benefiting from your expertise?
Yeah, we see a lot of interest from developers, especially in a tight, debt and equity market. Finding new ways to unlock the capital stack is, I think, really appealing to them. A lot of design firms, from MEP firms to architects, are trying to figure out, their clients want to know, hey, what do you guys know about this green finance stuff? And they're probably not in a good place to walk them through it. And so the design firms are finding really, I think, some competitive advantages to having a green finance person on their design team. The session at AIA last week was with some architects, and it really was about leveraging ESG expertise as architects. And how do architects and designers generally go from being just responsible for designing the thing to really being seen more as an advisor that can help developers, portfolios, tenants really maximize their real estate strategy. So portfolio clients, we just did our first rec and carbon offset purchase for one of our portfolio clients. Big presence down in Charlotte on a 500-acre site. The green financing stuff is what I really brought to SIG, and wanted to know if we could stand up a whole department around it. And in turn, they said, that's great. Yep, we believe in it. We believe in you. But we also want you to stand up a rec and carbon offset business. So we partnered with STX out in New York City. STX is the world's largest provider of environmental commodities, meaning RECs or EACs, if you want to call them that, or carbon offsets. And so now we can go directly to STX rather than through 2 or 3 layers of middle people and cut out a bunch of markup, and really probably have some of the best rec and offset pricing in the marketplace, we believe.
Okay. Well, you kind of alluded to the fact that we're seeing some real challenges in the capital markets now, and higher interest rates, et cetera. You know, amid that environment, are you seeing more interest in green financing?
Absolutely. There's really a whole universe of factors that are pushing us towards decarbonization as an economy, as a society, and green finance is how we, implement decarbonization in the built environment. We're seeing popular sentiment at all-time highs to do something about climate change. The Pew Research poll that came out around Earth Day, the number that stuck out at me was 71% of respondents across the political spectrum agreed that we need to do something about climate change. What we do and how we do it and who pays for it, I'm sure there are a lot of different opinions, but popular sentiment is there. The climate science is so clear. We understand it very well, what's happening with the ice and the water and the atmosphere. Environmental and racial justice is pushing us to decarbonize as we realize more and more that those who probably have had the least hand in creating climate change are most impacted by it. The technologies are driving. A couple of years ago now, I was at the Getting to Zero conference out in New York City. I met a new colleague, and she explained works in IT, and she's developing blockchain technology for kilowatt hours. So every kilowatt hour ostensibly will have its unique, serial number. And that allows you to do two things. It allows you to know the provenance of every kilowatt hour. How green is that kilowatt hour? Do I want a brown kilowatt hour? And to price it and monetize it. So her comment was, we have and will have even millions more electric vehicles driving around the country. And those batteries can be an extended part of the grid with what's known as vehicle to grid charging. And so her comment was, 5 years from now, your side hustle might be you get a ping on your phone. Click here to sell $40 of electricity out of your battery back to the grid because it's peaking and we need it. So the technology, the solar panels we put up today are 30% more efficient than the ones we put on my church in South Minneapolis 10, 12 years ago. The technology is driving these changes. The ESG investor class internationally is driving these changes. And I know you hear there is probably some good rationale to be concerned about ESG and greenwashing. But you also hear of, folks making it political, and there's, 20 states now that have directed their pension funds not to invest in ESG directed funds. Last time I added it up, it looked like about 500 billion nationally that was being pulled out of that marketplace. But we know in 2024, the ESG investor marketplace is going to be over $3 trillion. So I don't think it's slowing down. It's not going away. There's palpable risk in the marketplace, carbon transition risk. Really smart portfolio folks are modeling their portfolios against some of the more aggressive local laws. Birdo 2.0 in Boston, Denver, New York City, Title 24 in California. There could become a point where and asset managers and risk managers are already there. They're already way ahead of the regulators on this. They know that there is asset risk as we transition away from fossil fuels. And what is that carbon transition risk? How do they price that risk? And the palpable risk of climate damage, whether it's tornadoes, hurricanes, wildfires. It's so palpable that it's very real. And political sentiment and regulation is really driving. So all of these factors together, I call it the great alignment. And they've aligned these forces that are pushing our economy and the built environment to decarbonize. How do we unlock that? We use these great green financing tools. And there's more, the Port Authority has one of the most successful PACE, property assessed clean energy financing programs in the country. 350 deals, $400 million of some investment. I sat on our internal credit committee and reviewed and approved, voted on those deals. PACE is well known, well understood. The IRA is going to be a big hitter. But I presented a couple of weeks ago with the Assistant Commissioner for the Department of Commerce, Pete Wickoff, who's in charge of standing up the new state green bank. He's got 45 million of seed funds to start with. The state's got $100 million in matching grants to match federal money that's coming in. In 2024, the spigot is just getting turned on, and it's going to unlock some really cool things in our economy that people have thought about for a long time, but never really penciled out. And now we're aligning market and economic forces behind the great alignment.
Well, certainly a lot of exciting things happening there and a lot of different layers to this. And it seems like your work at the Port Authority really, you're used to taking on big, complex projects. You mentioned the Heights, for example. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that. We're talking about a net zero community, right? That will have, 1,000 housing units plus, 1 million square feet of light industrial space, I believe, good paying jobs. What was it like working on a project like that with so many different partners and so much complexity? Can you give me a sense of that?
It was about all I could do. I mean, you can really only run one of those at a time. I've done it several times now, and you got to be on top of everything, from the environmental engineering to the traffic to the parks to the geologic and biologic features. I mean, it really is staggering. I had a great team at the Port Authority that, some of the brightest economic development thinkers in the state, if not the country, some great finance people, so I really got the chance to stand on the shoulders of giants and those that came before me. I took John Young's office. He was a VP of development at the Port Authority. Now he's a broker with Forte, very successful industrial broker. Just saw him the other day, actually. And so, it's people like that. When you walk in the door to a place and you've got 85 years of history in that organization of trying to figure out how to take down some of the most distressed real estate and turn it into something of value for the community. That's a pretty good head start. But did learn a lot. I was on the board of governors of several joint ventures with private sector developers, learned a lot from them. Was a sustainability guy that kind of bumbled my way into commercial real estate finance and brokerage, and a licensed broker and here in Minnesota, and all of that. You couldn't have written a story that got me to this sort of unicorn status today, with so many different pieces just having to sort of fall in place. So the Heights was really getting the master plan approved for the Heights and starting to transact the land. As I was leaving, I think the board meeting where they sort of wished me farewell and read a resolution and all that, that was where we approved we approved the Excel transaction, the first industrial transaction, natural gas headquarters facility with no natural gas running to it because we're getting off fossil fuels, right? The master housing developer, lead housing developer Sherman was announced at that same meeting. And so seeing, the implementation just starting to churn was really rewarding. And having worked with a great team of engineers and designers to figure out how, the challenge was out there, you should do this net zero, 112 acres, 1,000 housing units, 1,000 living wage jobs, and 1 million square feet of industrial. how would you do it? And we looked around the world and realized there wasn't a great playbook for doing this at scale. And Rick Carter from LHB, one of my mentors, said to me after they had done this sort of feasibility look-see, looked at maybe 100 projects around the world that were claiming to do this. He said, the good news, bad news and good news. The bad news is no one else has done this before. And the good news is no one else has done this before. We get to be the first. And so, it's not going to be easy, especially with industrial companies. Well, I just actually had lunch with one of my clients. I have been hired by one of the buyers there already to help figure out this financial modeling, and wants to build a net zero mass timber 22,000 square foot industrial building. Nothing, that stuff doesn't just fall off the shelf. And the interesting thing was today he was telling me he's got a new client. They're making utility scale. Think of it like a breaker box in your house, but a 4 megawatt breaker box, utility scale gears of sorts. And he says they had to test it. The client, they built it. They did all the electrical engineering, put all the components together, built the thing. And the client says they wanted a bench test of it before it was delivered. And well, we don't have 4 megawatts of power coming into our rinky-dink little manufacturing facility. But out at the Heights, he's going to need a boatload of electricity to test these supersized components that they now are starting a new business around. So there are going to be some challenges along the way. It's going to be an exciting ride, and I'm glad I could play my part. And now, kind of midlife reboot and go do consulting for some of the biggest players in the country. So I think there's a lot of stars aligning here. That's what I tell myself when I'm trying to sleep anyway.
Yeah, great stuff. Well, you mentioned you're a sustainability guy at heart. Can you talk a little bit more about that and sort of how you got into your current line of work and what you studied in college and the whole works?
Yeah. I really didn't know what I wanted to do in school, and had a class at the U of M called American Everyday Life. I was like, I'm an American. I have an everyday life. I should be able to pass this class. And in that class, we talked about all kinds of different socio-political, cultural stuff. We learned about Yucca Mountain. And so this is mid-90s, and was in the press at the time that the federal government wanted to bury a bunch of nuclear waste on indigenous land out in the desert, because that seemed like a good idea. And so, 1996, I hear the term environmental racism for the first time. What's that? That doesn't sound good. And I basically wrote my senior thesis on the Port Authority and on brownfields. And so I got out of there with this knowledge of brownfield funding, brownfield regulatory stuff, and went and interned at the Phelan Corridor Initiative. In the 90s, if you were in St. Paul, everybody knew about the Phelan Corridor Initiative, reclaiming some contaminated railroad tracks to build Phelan Boulevard, open up hundreds of acres for new housing and new businesses. And the Port Authority was in the game. They were saying they were going to bring 2,000 jobs back to the neighborhood, which they have done. 3 business centers. Last time I added it up, 2,200, 2,300 plus jobs. So Phelan Corridor, I met probably everyone I would work with or work for in St. Paul through the Phelan Corridor Initiative. Went to the state of Minnesota, a state agency called the Office of Environmental Assistance. And the OEA was the white hat environmental folks at the state. Didn't do regulatory stuff, did landfill planning and a lot of grants and technical assistance. And after I got in there, I realized there was this group called the Minnesota Sustainable Communities Network. This was about 3 or 4 professionals that ran this network back when it was really cool to get on an email listserv. It's basically a glorified email listserv, Minnesota Sustainable Communities Network. And through that network, it was a clearinghouse for everything about clean energy, energy efficiency, waste reduction. Everything, circular economy, eco-industrial development, stuff we're still talking about trying to figure out 25 years later. in the late 90s, the OEA was a hub, and there still are a cadre of professionals that came out of there, like myself, who got into some pretty advanced sustainability work, probably before we called it sustainability. We were probably still calling it smart growth or something back then. So went from there to manage, I was project director for something called the Great Northern Corridor. Inland Corridor was on the east side. Great Northern Corridor is in Frogtown in the north end. Same idea. Let's take all the great ideas from the Phelan Corridor. Let's redeploy them on another big site. And so I corralled 60 some organizations around making a walkable urban neighborhood happen on some pretty nasty contaminated stuff. One of the sites the Port Authority built on a brownfield there was the old Maxon Steel foundry. And when I started at the Great Northern Corridor, my boss gave me a brick and said, "Here you go. This is a brick. This is out of the smokestack from Maxon Steel in the Great Northern Corridor." And so I had it on a shelf next to my computer monitor for 5 years while I was there. Well, John Young, years later, would tell me, "Monty, you realize that smokestack was radioactive when we tore that building down." And you had that thing sitting next to your brain bucket for 5 years. For those on the podcast that can't see me, I'm as bald as a baby. So I don't know if 1 and 1 equals 2, but
yeah, that's quite a story. Hey, before I can't let you go without asking you about some of your past and present hobbies. I noticed on your bio on the website you've been involved in the local music community here, and well, most people settle for golf or pickleball. You were a top 10 in the nation amateur vert skateboarder. Wow, tell me about that.
yeah, 17, 18 years old. I think I retired by the time I was 19. My knees and ankles were just shot. But I competed nationally. You had to qualify locally, then regionally, make it to nationals. I think, when you say you were in the top 10, well, that means you weren't in the top 5. And I was 8th one year and 10th another year. At my current colleagues know all this, and so they recently, there's that cameo service where you can pay to get a celebrity to do a cameo. So in one of our all staff meetings, they had paid for Tony Hawk to come onto our cameo and shout me out by name, which, having skated with him 25 years ago, was really cool. Really cool thing. Great group at SIG. And yes, I do own a record label. I DJ, I produce. Right now, we still do a monthly house music event in Northeast Minneapolis, and first Friday of every month, and we're going on 12, almost 13 years now. So I've always said that's when we all had to used to wear suits and ties, I used to say that's what allowed me to wear a suit and tie 5 days a week, was knowing that I could go listen to some loud music and see all my friends.
Well, that's wonderful. It's a lot of stuff going on there, so good for you. Well, Monty, you've covered a lot of ground. Is there anything else you'd like to add before I let you go? It's been a fun conversation. So,
I want to encourage people to reach out and learn what they can about green finance. The Inflation Reduction Act is going to be a huge shot into our economy that I don't think people really understand the scale and scope of it. We now have tools to show people how to use it, things that investment committees will recognize, things that CFOs and lenders will recognize. Still some education to do around all of that, but it's real and it's here. And the money machine turns on in 2024 when people start filing taxes for all the great stuff they did this year. And for a lot of building systems, it's 30, 40, 50% coupons. It's a fire sale.
Nice. Well, great. Well, thanks again for your time, Monty. Keep up the good work, and hopefully we can stay in touch and chat more in the future about all the good things you're involved in. So
Anytime, Brian. Really appreciate the interest and hope you have a great Thanksgiving.
you as well. Thank you.
Thanks.